So Charles is going to join me for the live handover, and we'll be speaking with the editor-in-chief of The Economist, Zanny Minton-Beddoes.
So, Miranda, we have a minute and a bit left. Let's fill the space.
I'm excited to see, if this all comes together. And I mean, you were here last year, Charles.
I was.
Sort of how did sort of this part of the event work last year, and sort of how well are topics discussed here also discussed there? Do we have a sense of that?
Of course, it worked terribly well.
Yeah.
There were no technology glitches whatsoever. I thought the handover was really interesting, but more important than the handover itself, and we talked a little bit about some of the things that we spoke about in the room at the handover, but was the extraordinary interview, if you remember, with the Prime Minister of Luxembourg.
Yes.
Afterwards, which I thought was absolutely magnificent. We have another interview that we'll all be watching after we do the handover with Zanny. And let me just tell you who that is. Can we tell you who that is?
With Gina Miller.
With Gina Miller, exactly. And hopefully we'll reconvene after that on stage for a few final comments ourselves after we speak to Ulrich Zacher from the World Bank.
Absolutely,
Yep.
absolutely. But no, I wonder if they've been watching us, to be honest. I've had various messages from actually friends in the US, other parts of Asia, and my dear family in England watching. So
hello, everybody.
Yeah, exactly. So I very much hope that this is going out to the global audience that we hope that it is.
Well, as this is the handover, I would just like to say thank you to all of those people watching online, because after this we will go offline and London will come online. And there is Annie.
Yes!
Yes! Excellent! Charlie, Miranda, how are you? Tell us what you've been talking about in Hong Kong.
We've had a fascinating day, Zanny, so far. We've been looking at the public and the very personal. We've been discussing policy with lawmakers across the region and the diversity of approaches that are required. We've been sort of worrying about politics a little bit, haven't we?
Yeah, we've been worrying that, I suppose, the frame of challenges that we see in Europe around populism are perhaps a little bit different here, Zanny. A different set of social and political challenges, mainly, I think, around the deterioration in the democratic space in this region, particularly in countries like Indonesia. Malaysia, perhaps less so. We've seen a successful election there in Malaysia, and also Thailand. And that sort of squeezing of the openness, should I say, that underpins LGBT inclusion and rights and attitudes towards it.
So you've worried about the political shift, and what's your sense been of how the businesses that you have with you there today are reacting to that? Is there a sense that people are pushing back and that recognizing the greater responsibility that businesses and everybody else in society has to push against that?
I think one issue that's been really quite interesting and was actually discussed well in not the last panel but the one previously was the difference between multinational leaders on these issues and whether they can mentor or inspire or encourage SMEs, smaller firms, local firms to follow suit and to step up as well, because we've got some fantastic advocates, big name brands that we know around the world. What we need to do now is to get others to follow suit.
Yes, I think I would add that one of the challenges that we see here in this path to advocacy theme that we've been playing through the day is that even those progressive companies that you were talking about, many of them foreign MNCs, but some of them progressive Asian companies, do find the move to advocacy and the transition to advocacy, LGBT advocacy, quite challenging themselves. And if they find it challenging, there's a whole cohort of domestic Asian companies that have yet to even get onto the early rungs of the ladder and have yet to address LGBT issues at all. And I think that's one of the things that we, perhaps in this room, reflecting on how the day has gone, that we have not been able to really draw out a great deal because we don't have a lot of domestic Asian companies with us at the moment.
Well, we have, as you know, we are about to talk to Gina Miller on what it is to be an advocate and how to be an advocate. And I think you are in Hong Kong sticking with us to hear Gina's remarks. But it sounds like that's exactly the kind of advice and help that would be useful for those of you in the room there if you have been talking about the difficulties of moving to being an advocate. So with that, I think you guys go on to mute now, so it was nice to talk to you. Have a good rest of day, but do stay and listen to Gina, because I think Gina Miller, who frankly, Gina, do come and join me here on stage. She is obviously from the True and Fair campaign, known to many in the UK now as Ms. Anti-Brexit activist. Gina, lovely to see you. Hi. Wonderful to see you, but you were, and I don't know if everybody in the room knows this, an activist on many issues long before that.
Close to 30 years now.
Wow.
That I've been an activist and a campaigner in the world of social justice, investments, charities. I'm very good at making enemies.
But you're also very good at affecting change.
Well, if you decide to be an advocate, you are a change maker. And change doesn't come instantly or quickly, it takes time. So you need to be patient and you need to be very passionate about wanting to be an advocate, because wanting change means that you're inevitably going to come up against conflicts of interest and infrastructure and mindsets and unconscious biases, which I know you mentioned in the previous session. Because if I use a Muhammad Ali quote, people tend to get trapped in a narrow way of thinking, and they see change as impossible. But actually, the quote from Muhammad Ali is that impossible is a big word that's thrown around by small men who don't want to think about the difficult things. It's a great quote.
I didn't know that quote.
It's a great quote. It's actually a state of mind.
I'm going to write that down.
So I think you have to steel yourself to be an advocate. You invest time, energy. You need to know your stuff. You need to be armed with knowledge if you're going to take on a battle. And you're constantly having to refresh that knowledge base because, sands shift and you need to stay alert to what's going on. And obviously, you will then have the abusive side of it because people push back when it comes to change.
So let's start, because I think the really interesting thing for everyone here is to glean the lessons of effective advocacy that can be then used in the LGBT journey as well. And the first is, and you've made it sound a big challenge being an advocate, but first of all, what's the hardest thing that you've learned? What have you learned that, looking back on an amazing life of advocacy, what for you have been the lessons that you've learned that say, this is the tips I've learned that enable me to now be a more successful advocate than I was?
You have to do quite a lot of work on yourself first. You need to steel yourself to protect yourself against other people. Because if you're going to go into battle and you're going to get arrows and words thrown at you, you need to build up strategies of how you're going to deal with that. And very much being honest about your strengths and weaknesses. And so you need to do a job of work. It's a bit of like getting ready for a race. You need to actually become fit to do that job, to go on the road of advocacy. And you need to create bandwidth, ways of healing yourself when you've had terrible days, because there will be a lot of frustration, there'll be a lot of anger that you get. And it's how do you deal with that? And then you have to change your mindset, because the way we are brought up, in a Western culture in particular, is to practice what I call dichotomous thinking. So it's extreme thinking. We think about right and wrong, strong and weak, success and failure. And when you do that, you actually create problems for yourself. And I think you have to be far more dualist in your thinking and your approach, far more flexible, because you have to put yourself as an advocate in the other side of the table, in somebody else's shoes as well. You have to be able to see all parts. You have to be able to do prismatic thinking rather than that dichotomous thinking.
What was the first thing you advocated for?
Well, I was always a difficult child. I can't actually ever remember not asking why. and why again, and probably I haven't grown up. But the real battle, I think there's something about, I'm often asked about women being advocates, and actually, do we have an edge? And I think we do, because of our empathy, but also from an anthropological point of view, we are lionesses. We tend to look after our young. And for me, my first advocacy was my eldest daughter, who was 30 last week. But if people remember the NHS, back in the 70s and 80s, it was on its knees. And on the night that she was born, I was expecting my beautiful baby, there were no midwives to deliver her, so she was starved of oxygen. And so my battle was for her. That was the first battle. Taking on a system which didn't have statementing, which didn't actually protect children like her who want to institutionalize her. So that was my first battle, and both in policy, changing the statement system, getting kids on the special needs spectrum to get special care. That took a long time, but that was my first battle.
And how did you do that? What was the
because I'd studied as a lawyer, I basically did my homework. I looked at the law, I looked at policy making, I looked at how I could change what was being done by local authorities, by the educational establishments, went to see doctors all the way around the world, tried to introduce different ways of language, actually, is interesting, because language can be used as a weapon by both sides of advocacy, depending on which side you are. And the language used for children with special needs or disabilities was very much a negative language. So it's also about changing the language around abilities rather than disabilities. So I just set myself a strategy of how I would achieve it.
Do your homework, set yourself a strategy, really understand things. What advice do you give? And we have two audiences here. We have the audience in Hong Kong, which is in working in a geographic area where the LGBT agenda is sometimes a bit tougher to push forward. And we've had, and you were here for the earlier panel, a very upbeat start to the day here in the UK, but there is still a lot to do. So if you were, let's start with it. If you were in Asia and you are, one of those companies gets you involved and says, how do we push this agenda? How do we really advocate for change? What kinds of advice would you give?
It's very different in different cultures. You need to tackle it very differently. A bit like when you're marketing, you need to look at your local norms and how do you create a culture within that culture, because you can't change national cultures. But what you can do is create, if you like, plant seeds that can then create change in those cultures. And I think one of the things I'd say is if you're going to advocate change, then you have to find champions, you have to find leaders, and you have to make them the change makers. So that's a good place to start, but then you have to protect them when they're there, because the one thing, you cannot be a delicate flower when you are a change maker. I call myself a dragon flower. You have to learn particular tips. But going back to your early question about what you learn, I'd like to share the fact that actually, some of the most difficult things is doing it at the start. The first time you start this journey, it's difficult, but it becomes easier. It actually becomes a habit. It becomes part of who you are. It is now part of who I am. I can't not do it. I have to speak up. I mean, I get that feeling in the pit of my stomach when I know something is wrong, in my second brain, if you like. And I have to just do something. I have to speak up. It becomes part of who you are. So it's a personality trait. So as you start on the journey, know that being brave or courageous or an advocate, whatever you want to call it, actually becomes easier the more you do it.
There are presumably many things that you would want to speak up about. How do you decide what you're going to advocate for?
So you have to, it goes back to knowledge. Because there are many things. We all would love to live in a world where there are so many things that are put right. But if you think about it this way, that if you start with knowledge and you know that you can change things because you have the tools, that somebody cannot knock down your debates and your arguments with intellectual dishonesty, which is often used against you, it's very hard when you know your stuff. And I tend to look at it this way, that if I'm picking a fight where they're attacking me and not what I'm saying, then I know I'm right. That's done a lot. So I just say, right, fine, thank you so much. You've actually given me permission to carry on by attacking me. Yeah. So I think you've got to think about it this way. You know, if I give you an analogy, I'm a storyteller. That's the other thing that's really important to do, is to learn to storytell. Don't use ridiculous technical words or phrases, because actually, to be an advocate, you need people to understand and come with you. And that means, from a point of view of proximity, in their understanding, their psychology, and even geographically, they have to come with you. And so you have to storytell. It's a very important part of being an advocate. The thing I'd say from that point of view is, what's the point of flicking a coin to a beggar? It's much more important that you understand the edifices that need to change to make sure that beggar is not on the street. And so those are the thought processes I go through before I take on a task. And I will think of not just the intended, but the unintended consequences. It is very important to do that, because you can be passionate about something and start on the road of advocacy, but actually create worse outcomes than you intend because of the unintended consequences. So it's very important that you do your homework, not just from knowledge, but understanding what's going to come at you, the limitations, other stakeholders' positionings in this. It's almost like a game of chess, where you're forever having to look at it and see and work out where the pieces are going to go and what the possible outcomes could be.
How important is it to have sort of clear and concrete goals?
Oh, you can't.
You can't.
You can start, it's impossible. If you do that, you'll be in mourning for loss all the time. It's no point. You can't do that. You have to have a top-line strategy, if you like. You have to have a direction of travel, but there are many paths to it. And then you also, apart from that, you have to figure out, actually, more importantly, how you're going to measure success.
That was going to be my next question.
Because that's as important as the outcome. How are you going to measure your success? And I believe there's an ancient power of three. A lot of what I'm saying, by the way, is backed up by science and data. I research my stuff. And so the other thing is concentrating on this ancient power of three. And it goes all the way back to religion and the Egyptians. The power of three is very important, because most people can accept 3 messages, 3 seconds to make up your mind about someone. The the cross has 3 points. There's so many things in this. And I tend to set myself, if you like, 3 success goals. One tends to be other people, for an outcome for the consumers that I'm fighting for, or the people I'm fighting for. The second tends to be the longer term goal, if there's a medium or longer term goal that I can achieve. And the third one tends to be actually selfishly about what I will learn from it. Because the more you learn as an advocate, the better you are for the next fight. So you need to always come back to checking yourself and seeing if you did something right or wrong, and learning from your failures.
An outcome for the consumers you're fighting
Yes.
for right now, a long-term goal, and then something that you yourself will learn.
Yes.
That sounds like an extremely useful power of three. I heard somebody say exactly a lot. Would that person, whoever it was, like to jump in? Yes. Yeah. With the microphone, so the people in Hong Kong can hear you at least.
Thank you so much. I'm Sue Sanders. I'm the chair of an organisation called Schools Out. We've been in existence since 1974. And I just felt you were talking about the sort of things that I've been doing for the last 50 years. I think the thing that it's so powerful what you're saying. And for me, it's when you're an advocate, the challenge is to learn when to be charming and when to be an absolute bloody nuisance. And which to do when, and that can shift within a minute. And it can also who you're working with and making choices about, are you going to hit the government? And I use the word advisably, but probably not. I work primarily in education, and the Department of Education has never been my friend, which is really interesting. they've never really understood about LGBT issues. The extraordinary thing was, after the Stephen Lawrence inquiry, the criminal justice system of all the areas suddenly woke up to actually recognizing the need to tackle homophobia. And it's changing, and then suddenly seeing a potential ally where you never, ever, ever thought you might find one. So I found myself working in New Scotland Yard with police officers, having been in Greenham and having been arrested and been treated atrociously by them. So that making shifts and suddenly recognizing where your allies might be, often in places that you would never, ever think they might be. So it's that, I think I recognize what you were saying, Gina, it's like a dance. You then see, oh, there's an opening, and you jump in there, and then another door closes, but then you find somewhere else. So it's that constant looking to see where you can make a difference, and making those links.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
There's one thing, touching on this, on where we are as a society at the moment, it is very tough being an advocate, because the way, if you look, and I mean politics in a small p when I say what I'm about to say, in that the political environment in our Western cultures has actually been one that's used two tools. One is difference and division, so divide and conquer, basically, which has actually highlighted differences. So when you're an advocate from an LGBT grouping of whatever form, it's actually becoming tougher because of the abuse that is now becoming more normalized and is being allowed, and it's not being called out by people in levels, all people across all sectors who are in positions of responsibility, who in my view are being criminally irresponsible in not calling out what's going on. And the second thing is that the second tool that's used is the devaluing of institutions and experts. It's an interesting tool that's used, and it's happened throughout history, because that's the other thing, I'm a history geek. I tend to look, both anthropology and history are things that I take a lot of my lessons from. And you know, if you say institutions don't matter, education doesn't matter, academia doesn't matter, judges don't matter, the rule of law doesn't matter, what you've done then is create an environment where people cannot speak up because they're not respected. And that is happening. And it's not just happening, I know in Hong Kong you talked about the rise of populism. This doesn't happen overnight. This has been happening, and deliberately, in my view, been the agenda for quite some time. And the rest of us, many people in this room possibly, we've all been a bit lazy. We sort of let democracy carry on, and we've loved the life that we've had, but we've not really been active citizens. We haven't really, we are all advocates.
I mean, I hear you, and I think there's clearly a lot of truth to what you're saying in terms of the nature of the sort of political moment we're in, frankly, not only in Asia, but in both sides of the Atlantic, this sort of them versus us political moment. But at the same time, I was struck by the optimism of our first panel and the sense of enormous progress that has happened in, you know, iconic big companies. So there's a sort of an interesting dichotomy here, because you put your finger rightly on a society where there's a lot of things that are, you know, moving backwards, or at least not progressing, and you know, your advocacy on other issues sort of epitomizes that. But at the same time, there has been a huge amount of progress on the LGBT agenda, and so it's not all black. I guess it's not all dark.
No, it's not. It's not. But you know, there are waves. We go through waves of change, and things are getting better. And there are conversations we're having now, which we wouldn't have had 20 years ago when I started in the city. You know, they just wouldn't have happened. You know, the things I was told in the city then, I would not be allowed today. But we have to be vigilant, because those changes can go and come in, and as I said, there are waves of change. And what I'm just concerned about, I mean, it's fantastic the change that's happening in the corporate world and big corporates, but you know, there is a part of me that gets suspicious and think, how much of it is tick boxing change? How much is it, for example, I'm going to launch in the city, I'll give you an example. So I'm going to launch because it's a thing, it's the power of women, it's the 100-year anniversary of the suffragettes, you know, the Me Too campaign. What I'm going to do is launch a fund for women, because that's what we female investors want, a fund for women. And I think, hang on a minute. Let's think about the shallowness of that, because actually men and women need the same things. There's no real difference in the fact you want a return from your money that you invested. But if you're only going to invest in companies that only have women at the top of the company, what happens if the next person's a man? Are you going to sell that fund, that stock? How are you going to keep track with it? Then suddenly you end up with a fund that's so active, that has so much transaction costs within it, that it then becomes extremely expensive, low-performing fund. How does that achieve? Because, you know, where is the thinking? And I just want, and again, just another example on the idea that, you know, parity of pay, because I did a lot of work. So I did text in 3 EU directives. One of them is shareholder directive that comes in January next year. So this idea that equal pay, you know, in too many companies, the gap is closing, or appears to be closing, because bonuses are not included. So there's a disparity happening. The shift of inequality in pay is being shifted to the bonus instead of the actual pay. So you have to be very careful, and that's what I'd say about being vigilant about change.
Vigilant about not tick boxing, and vigilant about making sure that you're not instituting
Different
superficial
problems.
changes that then cause different problems.
Yes, exactly.
But doesn't that come down to some of the things that we were talking about in the first panel, the genuine commitment at the top and the genuine commitment to measure properly?
The top culture is set from the top.
Yeah.
It absolutely is. And I think what's so fantastic is actually the diversity we're seeing at the top of many companies, not just gender. Because actually diversity there's been too much concentration, from my point of view, on external diversity. We haven't actually looked at diversity of mindsets and unconscious bias, because actually, coming from the same university, the same private schools, it doesn't matter what you look like on the outside. If on the inside you're thinking exactly the same, then you haven't created real change. So it's that sort of change that I think we're seeing people from very diverse, truly diverse, internally and external diversity in companies, and that's what I think is the most exciting thing. True social mobility that's leading to diversity.
So what would you do, just to conclude, if your focus was not Brexit, but...
Well, my focus is not Brexit. I happen to do it in my spare time.
Goodness me, if that's your spare time.
It is my spare time. I run an investment business, a very disruptive investment business, and I run a foundation looking after 15 charities, and we do a huge amount of policy work. So I do keeping the government to account, if you like, because the opposition isn't, is what I do in my spare time. And that's what you do as an advocate. You find the bandwidth to do it.
If you were able to find a little bit more bandwidth to take on another cause, and that was to become an LGBT advocate, and that was your focus, if that were, what would your... And we were having here a strategy session on what you'd like to try and how you'd go about that. What would your advice be to everybody here on how to ensure that the progress that's made thus far continues and indeed increases?
The very first thing I do is say, go and talk to the groups that you're trying to promote and help. And the reason I say that is we were involved in a project for a very big law firm where we were trying to bring people from different backgrounds, ethnicities, social backgrounds into work in the city, in the law firms. And it was a great program, designed it all, and hardly anybody turned up after a while. They started on the course, it was a 6-week program. And what we realized is that we put them in a city, we didn't look at it from their point of view. You had people coming in, young women coming to work, feeling embarrassed by the clothes they were wearing, going out, being invited out for dinner when they had no idea actually how to order from the menu or how to use a knife and fork even, because they'd never sat down at home and had a meal with a knife and fork. So you have to look at things. It's all very well saying, I'm going to sit at this table with a whole group of people in my organization, and we're going to come up with a plan of how we're going to create diversity and promote equality in our company, without talking to the people you're actually going to try and help. So the first conversation, I would say, is with the people you're seeking to help, rather than diminishing, devaluing, and making them feel ashamed of who they are. Because anybody you're trying to help has to feel that you are not you're not pitying them. You're not there to say, you're vulnerable, therefore I need to help you. You're already setting yourself up on a higher plane than they're on. You actually have to start on exactly the same plane. So that first conversation is actually the most important thing.
So you start with that conversation, and then I think you're looking at the short-term outcome, the long-term goals, and what you learn yourself. Gina, I'm stunned. I'm still stunned at the idea that you're doing Brexit in your spare time. I think we have time for one more question for Gina, and then we need to say goodbye to Hong Kong. Yes, over there.
Hi, I'm Rob Harkavy from Twin Media. And you mentioned earlier on about the fragmentation or division of society into sort of silos of divide and rule, etc., and how that leads to a lot of abuse. Actually, before I ask the question, I think we've all noticed the abuse you've had over the Brexit thing you do in your spare time, so kind of well done for handling it with such amazing dignity, not just from sort of people on social media, but sort of in the press as well. It's quite inspirational. But I wonder if you think that sort of abuse and division has always been there and is exacerbated by social media, or do you think social media has been a catalyst for it, or am I completely wrong and social media has got nothing at all to do with it?
Ooh, it's a very big question, and I do think social media has a lot to do with it, because it's created what I call the ghettoizing of minds, because before you would have had people who were, if you look at the extremes of society, and they sat at the end of a pub bar or in a room with a couple of friends or whatever it is. But suddenly they have a huge platform, and it becomes like a feeding frenzy, because if you suddenly have other people agreeing with you and magnifying your voice, you're then emboldened to think that your voice is right, your position is right. And what happens is that people it concretes their point of view, it cements their point of view. I think it's very dangerous. It's very dangerous because it creates an amplification that other media haven't done. And I think, and I've always thought this, that the social media companies, it's a total disgrace that the way they have carried on to behave, even now behave and carry on to behave.
Gina, I'm just going to have to interrupt you briefly to say goodbye to Hong Kong.
Okay.
Goodbye, Hong Kong. Very nice to have you. Enjoy the rest of your day there. Sorry, we've just lost the Hong Kong.
But there's something, this all gets very complicated. I just want to say one thing on social media, which is, it's not the medium, it's the message. And I don't care where it is, in print, on media, social media, if it's one that incites sexual or racial violence, it is breaking the law and it should be stamped out. And if we keep to that simple message, we can actually do that. And can I just share with you one thing I got sent this morning, because I am human and I might handle it, but the abuse carries on. I didn't know I was so powerful. Apparently now I'm behind just about everything that happens with Brexit, which is quite extraordinary. But a tweet I got this morning and an email that I got this morning. So the tweet was, Hitler only killed 3 million people. Gina Miller has pissed off 17.4 million. And the email, which was, Meghan Markle has been diluted, her color. She's diluted to white. She's beautiful and she's effable. You are black, old, and should be whipped into obedience. That is what we are living with when I say there is division in society. And those are the reasons why I will not let those voices trump mine and why I'm not going anywhere.
Gina, thank you. That was an important but sobering note to end on. Thank you very much indeed. That was really, really interesting. Very nice of you to be here. Thank you.